Hello everybody, my name is Shortline614 and welcome to episode 3 of Shortline's Rail News and Comment, and today we are going to be talking about why CSX is buying Pan Am Railways. And before I begin, I would like to thank all of you. I would like to thank all the people who have viewed the videos, who have commented on the videos, who subscribed to my channel. It's honestly quite humbling that so many people want to watch me ramble about trains and railroads for, 20 minutes or more. And I'd also like to thank the people over at Rare.net in this wonderful thread, CSX to acquire Pan Am Railways, because without them and without all their knowledge and everything I've learned from this thread because of them, this video simply wouldn't be possible. So let's get into why CSX is acquiring Pan Am Railways, and before that, let's look at the history of Pan Am Railways. Now, Pan Am Railway's original name was the Guilford Rail System, and they were founded in the early 80s by Timothy Mellon, who was an investment banker. He came in and bought up all these struggling railroads in the Northeast and New England. He bought the Maine Central, he bought the Boston and Maine out of bankruptcy, and he bought the Delaware and Hudson off of the Norfolk and Western. And his goal was to form a futuristic transcontinental railroad, non-union futuristic transcontinental railroad. Now, of course, as the 80s wore on, this dream slowly died to a number of factors, mostly involving the failure of several acquisitions and union strikes, because there was a lot of pushback, because he basically tried to make these railroads all non-union, and there were a lot of strikes because of it, and there was a lot of pushback, and even because of that, the Delaware and Hudson had to be let go, because they simply couldn't hold on to it. And after that, they realized that, hey, this dream of this futuristic transcontinental railroad, it's dead, right? So we need to focus on what we have. And what we have is this New England rail system. We have the Maine Central, and we have the Boston and Maine. And what Pan Am Railways, or Guilford at the time, wanted to do was they wanted to become a New England terminal railroad, basically a big New England terminal railroad. So, in the early 90s, they signed an agreement with Conrail. Now, most of Guilford's traffic at the time went westward via Mechanicsville, New York, over the D&H, or Rotterdam Junction, New York, over Conrail. And they basically signed this agreement where they would shift most of the interchange away from New York to Worcester, Massachusetts. And the result of this is that over time, Pan Am Railway's largest interchange partner was Conrail, later CSX, after the split in 1999, at Worcester, Massachusetts. And, Pan Am Railways, they were rather smart, because they ended up playing, after the Conrail split, they played CSX and NS off each other. Eventually in 2009, NS and Pan Am Railways signed an agreement for Pan Am Southern, which was this joint venture for intermodal service from Rotterdam Junction to Ayer, Massachusetts, and that's 50% owned by Pan Am Railways, 50% owned by Norfolk Southern. And, over the past few years, things have been looking slightly up for Pan Am Railways. Pan Am Railways is still kind of a awful company. They don't really maintain their track. They use ancient locomotives. And generally, I think if you talk to most people, they will agree that Pan Am Railways has actively hurt the New England rail scene for a very long while. Now, I do think they did help save the New England rail scene in the 1980s, save it from ultimate destruction, but I think as time went on, they never really changed a whole lot of their philosophy, and they continued basically being, I don't want to call it the Penn Central of the Northeast, but they don't have a whole lot of great track. Most of their railroad outside where passenger trains run is 25 miles an hour, sometimes back down to 10. So, and plus Timothy Mellon, he is getting old, and he was in a scandal revolving around his book and him being a bit racist, and public display of Trump and getting into a lot of scandals and whatnot, and plus he's kind of old. So he decided to put his railroad up for sale in 2020, in the summer of 2020. And at the time, many thought that someone like Norfolk Southern would come in and buy it, someone like Canadian National might have come in and buy it. They were using, for the sale, Pan Am Railways was using a law firm or a brokerage firm that was headquartered a few blocks away from where CN is headquartered in Montreal, so that led to a lot of speculation. There are people threw around G&W or Watco or some other mystery bidder, Fortress Investment or whatnot, and eventually, to everyone's shock, it was CSX Transportation. Now, On the surface, this seemed a bit odd. Doesn't CSX directly parallel Pan Am Southern from Air to Rotterdam Junction? Aren't they competitors? Well, yes. But I think the reason why CSX bought it is you don't really need to look at that part of the railroad. Don't look at the Pan Am Southern part of the railroad. Look at the main part of Pan Am Railways, the Springfield Terminal part of Pan Am Railways, which stretches up from their primary interchange with CSX at Worcester, largest interchange with another railroad, that goes up via Dover and Portland and Waterville, and eventually at Northern Main Junction, and eventually up to Mattawakamie, and this interchange with J.D. Irving. Now, what is J.D. Irving? Well, J.D. Irving it's controlled by the powerful Irving family. It's a conglomerate. They own refineries, they own a few railroads up here, they own the Maine Northern, they own the Eastern Maine, they own the New Brunswick Southern. They bought these lines off of Canadian Pacific and off the Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic over the course of several decades, and they've built up this nice little empire up here in Maine and New Brunswick. They also are a large producer of building materials, of construction materials. Well, it makes sense. Maine is well known for not just its paper, but for its forestries and its lumber and drywall and all that material. Ends up going to a place that is served heavily by CSX transportation, known as the Southern United States. Now, if you've been in the Southern United States, especially if you've been around construction circles, my dad works in construction, and the Southeast has been undergoing a massive housing boom, and a lot of that material to build those houses, to build those new developments and buildings, comes from J.D. Irving and their factories and their sawmills and everything they have up in Maine and New Brunswick. Now, as it currently stands, that traffic can flow several ways. It can flow off the J.D. Irving short lines to Pan Am Railways at Keeg and go down to Worcester at CSX, and then CSX can take it to the southeast. It can go via Canadian National from St. John all the way down to Memphis and New Orleans, before it's interchanged with another railroad. Canadian Pacific, they can pick up that traffic at Brownsville Junction, take it to Albany or Montreal or Buffalo, and interchange that with Norfolk Southern. So there's several ways that this traffic is flowing right now. And CSX, by reaching up and grabbing, Pan Am Railways and getting access to J.D. Irving, can effectively, that traffic will basically only flow up to J.D. Irving's discretion. All that traffic, which is possibly worth millions of dollars, will flow over CSX from origin to destination. Single line service, which also makes it easier to ship because you don't have to deal with multiple railroads and multiple marketing departments and whatnot. CSX does indeed have, Pan Am Railways does indeed have haulage rights over much of the Irving Empire. So from Irving's perspective, sure, they transport it, but the waybills and whatnot will only be billed by one railroad, which is CSX. And you also have to look at St. John itself. St. John has been undergoing a massive expansion over the past few years. That was largely what motivated CP's purchase of the Central Maine and Quebec in 2020. And why is CSX doing this? Well, it's interesting because I think it is safe to say that the Canadian railroads over the past year or 2 years, they've been thoroughly distracted by other issues. Canadian National, if you remember at the beginning of 2020, they had blockades, they had shortages of all kinds, and then in 2021 you had the fight over Kansas City Southern. And honestly, I think CSX saw that, hey, the Canadians are distracted. Let's reach up, let's grab Pan Am Railways, and we can effectively take all of this Irving traffic, all this building material traffic, all this cargo traffic, even potentially some intermodal, even potentially some my mind's shutting down. Oil traffic. J.D. Irving has a refinery up there. We can take all this traffic that's currently going, at least some portion, over the Canadian rails, and we can just take that all for ourselves, and we could have single line service and grow that traffic. And this is very smart from CSX's perspective, because they are effectively, by acquiring Pan Am Railways, they are more or less raiding traffic off of the Canadian railroads in eastern Canada. Now, whether the deal, the actual structure of the deal is particularly interesting, because let's go back to our map. The main issue when CSX first announced that they were acquiring Pan Am Railways is what is going to happen to Pan Am Southern, the joint venture with Norfolk Southern. What was going to happen with the main part of Pan Am Railways was fairly obvious. Well, it's just going to be merged into CSX. What happens with Pan Am Southern? And the deal that was struck is particularly interesting, as in CSX and NS will continue to 50-50 own Pan Am Southern. However, the actual operations of Pan Am Southern will be leased out to Genesee and Wyoming and their Berkshire and Eastern subsidiary. And how it works is G&W and the B&E will basically operate Pan Am Southern on behalf of CSX and NS, with CSX and NS still controlling all the shots. And CSX, CSX also will grant or wants to grant Norfolk Southern trackage rights over the Boston and Albany, over their main line in New England through Massachusetts, from from Denison through Selkirk and eventually through Springfield, Worcester, and then up to Ayr. Now, a short section of that was over the province of Worcester, which is also owned by G&W, and that's probably why they picked G&W to operate the Pan Am Southern. Now, there was also another problem, which is that G&W also owns the New England Central, and the New England Central and Pan Am Railways share track between East Northfield, Massachusetts, and White River Junction. They serve the same line. And this put the Vermont rail system into kind of a bit of a pickle, because that would result in the vast majority of their interchange partners being with a G&W road, and honestly, the New England Central, which in many cases directly competes against the Vermont rail system. So they eventually signed an agreement where the Vermont rail system is going to get a whole bunch of trackage rights. They're going to get trackage rights from, White River Junction down to Bellows Falls, and eventually to East Deerfield, which is where the main yard is. Their CSX and NS are also going to get haulage rights. CSX and NS are going to get haulage rights from the capital city area, the Albany area, to Hoosick Junction to interchange with the Vermont rail system, and NS is going to also get haulage rights to East Deerfield to interchange with the Vermont rail system, because as it currently stands, the only traffic that they can send over Pan Am Southern is intermodal traffic, NS, and eventually that's all going to shift to CSX anyways, and that kind of puts the future of many parts of Pan Am Southern, including the route over the Hoosick Tunnel, in doubt. Although, CSX and NS and G&W say that they're still going to maintain the Hoosick Tunnel route, because most carload traffic is actually going to flow that way. Most of the intermodal traffic is going to flow over CSX's route, while most of the carload traffic is going to flow over Pan Am Southern. So they say that there's basically, if the Hoosick Tunnel collapsed again, they'd have to fix it, because, well, the Boston and Albany line, CSX's line, simply can't take all that traffic. To what degree that is true, I don't know. Perhaps someone can enlighten me in the comments. And this has been particularly interesting because CSX will control one line into New England and 50% of another line into New England, and that has basically brought a lot of competitive questions up. Like, I believe the Department of Justice says if this merger were to go ahead, they would want CSX to sell their 50% in Pan Am Southern to somebody else. And I can't help but think that CSX, being 50% owning Pan Am Southern they're gonna try and de-emphasize that route in favor of their own. And honestly, I would prefer if there was a condition attached, or maybe, within a certain number of years, Pan Am Southern, the 50% of Pan Am Southern CSX owns, is sold to somebody else, perhaps sold out to NS in its entirety, or G&W or somebody like that. And CSX has seemed to indicated they're going to do that someday, not on the outset. And this whole deal is particularly weird because there's a lot of valid issues with the Vermont rail system they had valid complaints. Canadian Pacific, talking about maintaining the route through the Hoosick Tunnel, they were complaining about that. I think they have valid complaints. Amtrak also wanted CSX to guarantee a whole bunch of expansion, and they've now come to a deal where, CSX basically just said, sure, Amtrak, do whatever you want. Which, honestly, to me, it sounds like that CSX just wanted Amtrak to go away, so they just agreed to the conditions. The Vermont rail system, I think, is... Sure, they have a lot of interchanges on paper. On paper, they have interchanges with CSX and NS now. But I can't help but think that the deal that they struck really doesn't change a whole lot, because they still basically directly interchange with the G&W road basically everywhere. So I can't help but fear that the Vermont rail system, on paper, G&W says they're not going to bias the NECR over the Berkshire and Eastern, which is, yeah, sure. I doubt that, to be honest, based off of just history. When other stuff has happened like this, for example, the Baltimore and Ohio and the Western Maryland. And I can't help but feel that the Vermont rail system is going to be a bit constrained, kind of develop D&H syndrome, I'd call it, where the vast majority of your interchanges with other railroads are over trackage rights belonging to somebody else. So there are aspects that I like. For example, as I previously stated, Pan Am Railways does a horrible job at maintaining their track, and CSX wants to invest $100 million into the Pan Am Railways lines to actually make them decent, replacing motive power, upgrading from 10 to 25 in some places, keeping it at 25 because Pan Am Railways will upgrade a line and then they'll let it deteriorate back down to the minimum. Overhauling yards and whatnot. The whole situation involving Pan Am Southern and the Vermont rail system, I can't help but be a bit concerned. I think they should keep an eye on that. Let me just say that. There's also a lot of other people who have a lot of also kind of bizarre complaints who think that, the merger should be denied based off of, one minor complaint that's so minor that it greatly outweighs I think a lot of the positive benefits of this. There were several towns and cities who were complaining that they would see 1 or 2 extra trains a day or stuff like that, and New England is generally a region where, small complaints like that are generally blown out of proportion. But yeah, that's CSX acquiring Pan Am Railways. It's going to be interesting. Now, they did have a hearing about this a few days ago. I did not watch it. I did see snippets, and the main thing was Chairman Oberman, Mr. Oberman of the Surface Transportation Board, questioned the need for CSX to spend all this money to buy Pan Am Railways and then spend another $100 million to upgrade it, because according to CSX's figures in the document, in the STB filing, traffic, I think, will grow by 2% over the first 2 years, and then only 1% over the next years. And Chairman Oberman basically said that he doesn't really understand why there's an economic case for investing all this money in these lines when there's not going to get a whole lot of traffic, which I find particularly a bit hypocritical coming from Chairman Oberman, because for a man who constantly rightly criticizes Class 1 railroads for focusing on the short term and not investing long term in their future and whatnot, him criticizing a deal that CSX by admission says is a long-term play is, as I said, it's a bit hypocritical. Also, I don't think, and I don't know this for certain, but I think a lot of that traffic growth, I think the figures that CSX aren't citing are the carloads and the traffic they will gain by basically taking away traffic from the Canadian roads. So that must factor into it as well. And I think the merger will be approved? I do think there will be a few conditions. CSX themselves have already said they want a few conditions attached that they've agreed with Amtrak and the Vermont rail system. Will there be something relating to Pan Am Southern? I wouldn't be surprised if the STB said CSX has to sell their share in Pan Am Southern within a certain amount of time, within 2 or 3 years. And honestly, I would personally support such a condition. And do I think it will be a positive thing for New England? I think it will, because talk to anybody, Pan Am Railways is kind of awful. And say what you want about CSX. CSX is not the best railroad in the world either, but at least, at the very minimum, they maintain their track. Which is something you cannot say for Pan Am Railways, and as long as you maintain your track, as long you can, get shit over the road and whatnot, and motive power as well. CSX doesn't have motive power that's ancient, unlike Pan Am Railways. And I think these very basic things that CSX is going to come in and actually make it a functioning railroad, not even a good railroad, just a functioning railroad, which I don't think you can say for Pan Am right now, will probably be very beneficial. And you'll probably see a lot of investment in these lines, a lot of growth over these lines. And I generally believe that, with the exception of, some of the issues revolving around Pan Am Southern, I generally think this is a positive thing. What about all of you in the comments? I'd love to hear what all of you think in the comments. And, thank you all for watching, and I will see y'all in the next episode of Shortline's Rail News and Comment. Goodbye, everybody.